Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another Game Finds video. Here I'm going to be showing you some of my latest game finds from a brick and mortar store that's in my area as they hosted their annual Vault event. And the Vault event is something that the local game store in my area does at least once a year, where they give game collectors a chance to collect some of the more rare and hard to find games that you may not find typically in their store. From my understanding, what they do is they just hold back a few of these games so that they can release them on the store floor all at once, and then game collectors can get a chance to go through the vault by taking a number and then selecting the games that they want, but they limit you to just 2 items at a time until eventually everyone has had enough turns to where it can just be open for a free-for-all. I arrived at this event a bit late and was not there while they were drawing numbers, so I actually just had free and full access to what was left after the other game collectors got their picks in. Taking a look at what I grabbed from the event, the first game I grabbed was Gun Valkyrie for the Microsoft Xbox Original. This game is a third-person shooter game that was developed by Smilebit, which is now known as Sega Sports R&D, but they actually got their start by developing games for Sega on the Microsoft Xbox, with a couple of their other games being Jet Set Radio Future and Panzer Dragoon Orta. Something I like about this game is that it takes place in an alternate history future where the British Empire not only still rules the world, but also rules various other planets in the solar system. In this game, you take on the task of exterminating giant insects that infest the colonies of the planet, but to do so I have to warn you that you will have to learn some very complex controls for some of the basic tasks in the game. To me, the controls remind me of what Ape Escape was to the PlayStation. In that game, it was basically built around the new features of dual analog sticks on the PlayStation, so they incorporated a lot of that into the control scheme. In here, the game is very focused on using the triggers, but not just for shooting. In fact, if you look up other reviews of this game, you will see a lot of criticism over the very complex controls. And when doing a little bit of research on this game, I did find out that the game was originally intended to be released on the Sega Dreamcast, which makes sense because the triggers were brand new to that console. I will say that once I started mastering the controls, the game did get easier, but it was very difficult to master the controls, especially when jumping back and forth between games. Even though this is an original Xbox release, I did capture this on my Xbox Series X as it's one of the few that is still compatible on the system, and I did have a lot of fun getting through this game. The next Xbox game that I picked up was Godzilla Save the Earth, and longtime fans of the channel may have picked up that I am a huge Godzilla fan in terms of the movies, so when I see a Godzilla game I feel like I have to try it out. This particular game also got a release on the PlayStation 2, but this is the only version of this game that I have in my collection now. This game was published by Atari in the mid-2000s, and that was an interesting time for the company, but that's a whole nother story. And it was developed by Pipeworks Software, which they're probably most known for these Godzilla games, but also for a lot of other licensed franchises. But most notably to me, they actually produced the copy of Wheel of Fortune I stream quite often when I do live streams, which is the one on the Wii from 2010. However, for some of the younger gamers out there, they're actually the ones responsible for porting Terraria to the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. And this game revolves around a plot that is a sequel to their earlier game, Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, in which aliens have come to invade Earth, and it's up to Godzilla and his band to stop them, but this story is only important to loosely tie together while you're in a Godzilla fighting game. And as much as I really wanted to get into this game because I'm a real big fan of the Godzilla universe, and I'm really a big fan of the fights that you can have between Godzilla and the other monsters in its universe, sadly, this is a game I just didn't enjoy as much, mainly because I felt that the controls here are a bit too slow and just not what I wanted to see for a 3D fighting game. Visually, the game does look nice, especially for the time period, and as a fan of the franchise, it is a thrill to get to go through some of these environments, taking out buildings and cities as you take down your enemy. But it did leave me wanting a little bit more, as the controls and the way the game feels just isn't as good as something like the other 3D games out at the time. So with that in mind, I would really only recommend this to fans of the Godzilla franchise, because if you're a 3D fighting games fan, you can find better elsewhere. But I'm really only referring to my experience with the single-player mode, because I think with any fighting game, if you just add in a second player, it becomes a lot more fun than playing against the CPU.
KO.
Godzilla 2001.
You win.
Next up is Aliens vs. Predator Extinction, and this is a media franchise where I'm actually a bigger fan of the games, more specifically the Aliens vs. Predator game that came out on PCs in the late 90s, early 2000s, as I had a lot of fun playing that on my old Windows 98 PC. This game, however, is not what I was expecting, as the PC game I referenced was a first-person shooter. This one, by contrast, is a tactical real-time strategy game. And I'm going to be honest, initially I was a bit disappointed in that because I didn't know anything about this game when I picked it up, other than, oh, I really liked that game on the PC, I wonder if this is a port of that game to the Xbox. And if you were like me and didn't do your research, I don't want you falling into that same trap, but to be honest, I actually really enjoyed this game. Looking at this game, it's very much stylized like those real-time strategy games I was playing on the PC, notably Age of Empires at the time, and this one just adds in a bit more combat focus, but you still have to do a lot of resource building as well. And I dumped a lot more time into this game than I was expecting to when I first found out it was a real-time strategy game. My only major criticism with this game is the same as with any real-time strategy game on a console, is that if it lacks mouse support, it can get really tedious trying to select menu controls that were obviously made for a mouse, because it takes a while for your cursor to go between options with just the analog joysticks. Overall, though, I think fans of this franchise will get a kick out of it, and real-time strategy games shouldn't be too disappointed. However, I will note that the AI does go from being very easy to very difficult very quickly, and then back and forth. I will also say a common criticism of this game is that there's just not a lot of content in the game, and it's fairly short. Those aren't issues for me, but since this also kind of fetches a bit of a premium for Xbox games, this may not be for everybody.
Copy that.
Another game I knew little about when I picked it up was Fist of the North Star, Ken's Rage 2, and although this game was released on the PlayStation 3 and Wii U and other regions, in North America the only physical copy we got of this game was on the 360. This game combines the universe of Fist of the North Star with the gameplay of the Dynasty Warriors series. And if you're not familiar with that franchise, basically you have a ton of enemies that surround you at once, and you have to take them all out. The way this game plays really reminds me of those classic beat-em-up games with a simple control scheme of punch, kick, strong punch, strong kick, and maybe some special moves, but cranked up a bit because of the large number of enemies you have to take out at once, and it's accompanied by a rockin' soundtrack that I really just had to crank up while I was playing. It really gets you into the mood to take out a horde of enemies. In terms of graphics, I feel like the character designs are done really well, and I really like the amount of blood that flies off of enemies when you take them out, but the environments seem a little generic to me. I don't know how to really describe that other than it's kind of muddied down, at least in these early stages as I'm still playing through the game. But if I'm being honest, I really think that if you're a fan of this franchise, or a fan of the Dynasty Warriors style of play, you're going to get a moment's enjoyment out of this game, and I would recommend it for those people. But when I looked up reviews of this game online, I was shocked to find out that some of the review sites had scores as low as 3 out of 10 for this game, and I feel like that is way off base. Me personally, and again this is kind of an initial impression score, I would say around a 6 or a 7 out of 10, because I got really addicted in the gameplay style of this, but I realized if that's not your cup of tea, then yes, you may feel like this game is very basic, and if you're not into it, you're not into it. For me personally, I do not regret picking up this game, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. This is actually one I've been back to a couple of times since capturing this footage, and I get a little further each time, and then I give it a break, play something else, and then come back to it. Next up is the oldest game I picked up in this Vault event, and that is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons: Eye of the Beholder. I'm actually a bit more familiar with this game because I just recently played it for the Ultimate Super Nintendo review on the channel, and this is a game I really feel like is a bit better on Sega CD, as they're able to add in some animated cutscenes and more detail into the graphics without having to worry about shrinking it down to fit into a cartridge. I feel like these old 3D first-person RPG-style games have a lot of charm to them, and they have a unique playstyle that you just don't see done today. Now that said, for some people, that's going to be a turnoff because there's a reason why they don't make them like this today. They were really limited by the technology they had, but still, going into this game and learning the controls, getting through the story, is kind of a nice treat and a nostalgic thrill for those of us that remember these games fondly. Next, I've been trying to beef up my Sega Saturn collection in anticipation of doing a future review of that system, and one of the games I didn't already have for it was Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams, which I do already have on the PlayStation 1, but I wanted to get a copy to compare it with on the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn is considered a huge flop in the United States, but it was more successful in Japan, which is why a lot of my games have actually come over from there, because there are games that just didn't release here in the US, or they're a lot cheaper to get over there, and the language barrier on a game like this wouldn't be too bad. But the biggest reason I picked this up is that games like this don't show up too often in my area because the Sega Saturn just wasn't popular around here. But also, finding these cases complete intact is also becoming a bit more of a rarity, as these weren't a great design to begin with because those plastic tabs on the hinges would just snap right off. With age, these cases are getting a lot more brittle, and so they're a lot less likely to be intact, especially if you get them shipped to you. But anyway, getting into the game, this is Street Fighter Alpha as I remember it, and it is a very faithful port of the game. In fact, I actually had a hard time putting this one down as I am a fan of this franchise. And I am always thrilled when I can add in a game that I can play with other people so I can share this console with people who may not have experienced it.
KO. You win. Yeah, that's it.
Next up is another Sega Saturn offering, and that is Shinobi Legions, which to my knowledge, I think this is the only system that this game ever released for, and is still locked to this platform. I am a fan of the Shinobi series from the Sega Genesis, as you play through the side-scrolling platform hack-and-slash style of action, but aside from the lengthy FMV cutscenes, it looks like this game could have been done on the Sega Genesis. Maybe not the soundtrack, but the graphics certainly look that way. That's not to say it's a bad thing. I think at the time that probably would have been a criticism, but nowadays I find this style nostalgic, and I am thrilled to see a game like this exist on the Saturn. As I've heard someone describe it, the Sega Saturn was basically an awesome 2D machine that they tricked into doing mediocre 3D. But when you look at 2D games of this time period, it is almost like they had perfected everything you wanted out of a 2D game, and this game plays great. However, if you are familiar with the difficulty level in the Shinobi franchise, it is back here. In fact, most of this gameplay footage I played through is with using my Action Replay cartridge and the invincibility cheat on. Overall, I felt like this was a great pickup. Although it was a bit more on the expensive side than I was willing to pay for, it certainly seemed to pay off for me, as I did get enjoyment out of it. Next, my only PlayStation 1 pickup was Bushido Blade 2, which is a fighting game that was published by Square and released in North America in 1998. I do already have the original in my collection, so I knew what I was getting into, and I did enjoy this game. But I will note that I noticed that this game is a bit differently designed, because the first one has like one large interconnected level where you play between different fights, but this one has a fight that basically takes place on a different map every time, and you're transported to a different location at the end of each fight. There are some other differences as well that some people may not like if they played the first one, but overall I feel like as a standalone entry, this game is pretty solid. Moving on to my PlayStation 2 game pickups, the first one here is Valkyrie Profile 2. I don't know how to say that. Is that Samaria? Anyway, this is the second installment in this series. It was developed by Tri-Ace and published by Square Enix, released for the PS2 late in its life in 2006. Though this is the second installment, the game is actually a bit of a prequel, taking place hundreds of years before the original game. This game revolves around two characters living in the same body, one of them named Samaria and the other one named Alicia. Together, these characters work to stop a catastrophe that could cause a war between the people and the gods. And I'm not that far into this game, as you might be able to tell from my game capture here. I just played it long enough to capture game footage, and I'll come back to it and play it in a little bit more detail. So all I have is my initial impression of that the game's graphics and sound are on par with the Square Enix releases of this time period. I was kind of surprised to see that the dungeon navigation and this navigation of the town here is done in a 2D side-scrolling perspective, which is something I was not expecting from a game of this time period. Looking at the reviews of this game, I've seen the word convoluted interface show up a few times, which can be used to describe the game's menu systems, and getting around it is a bit difficult in the beginning. But be warned, this game is not for the timid, as it has a high degree of difficulty. But that just makes it all the much more sweeter when you're finally able to get through the battles. Which, thankfully, the combat system I found fun and engaging, even if the battles were difficult. But I'll ask you guys out there, what am I in for the rest of this game, since this really is my initial impression? When I saw this copy of Persona 3 FES, I thought, oh, this is a game I already have, thankfully I don't have to buy it again. But when I looked at my collection notes, I'm like, oh, apparently I don't have this game. And it turns out I was a bit confused because I do have Persona 3, but I didn't have this version known as FES. I am a big fan of the Persona franchise, so because this is one I didn't already have in my collection, I thought I'd pick it up, and I was pleased to learn that this is a enhanced re-release of Persona 3 for the PS2, that contains an estimated additional 30 hours of gameplay over the original, which adds an epilogue onto the end of the game. But thankfully, you can choose between the journey or the answer at the very beginning if you want to skip over the original that you've already played. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Persona franchise, basically this game is a role-playing game, and I'll add in that it's also kind of like a social sim kind of game because a lot of the gameplay when you're not in the battle system involves socializing with your peers. This is a game I would recommend to people who are fans of the Persona franchise, or people who just really like the Japanese-style manga anime series. What I like most about this game is the combination of that serialized drama anime storyline, but with a beautifully stunning art style and a beautifully scored soundtrack that makes this game just one of the top tier for me.
Oh, are you the new student?
Gradius 3 and 4 is a compilation game combining the ports of the arcade versions of Gradius 3, which came out in 1989, and Gradius 4, which came out in 1999. The game itself was an early release title, but not quite a launch title here in the US for the Sony PlayStation 2. Games in the Gradius series are scrolling shoot-'em-up games, which I am a big fan of, so this is something that I personally look forward to collecting. I had recently played Gradius 3 for my review of the Super Nintendo, but this is actually my first time playing Gradius 4 to my knowledge, because I don't remember seeing this in arcades, and I was very much looking forward to trying this one out.
Thank you.
And last and perhaps the biggest pickup that I had on this game run was Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. This is a tactical role-playing game that was developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo for the Wii. It is a direct sequel to another highly desirable title for GameCube collectors, and that was Path of Radiance. I will say I picked this up specifically because this is a collector's item. It's a game that I hadn't played before and really didn't have too much interest in, other than the fact that I really wanted to see what was the big deal behind this franchise. Thankfully though, this is not one of the more expensive games that disappoints, as I did find this game fun and engaging. The only levels I got through so far are the tutorial levels, which are teaching you different things about the tactical combat system, but to tell you the truth, usually this is something that I'm not really into, and I really like the more action style, or turn-based style, of traditional RPG games, but this one just sucked me in for some reason. They are turn-based battles, but they take place on a square grid in which you move your characters around and can only attack once you're close to someone. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert about this game because I am a newcomer to this franchise. In fact, this is the first one I can remember ever playing. So if you guys have any tips or tricks for playing through this game, or you have another one in this series I need to try out, please let me know in the comments, and I look forward to trying this series out a bit more after I get through this one. But overall, this is my entire lot that I picked up from this Vault event, and yeah, these things weren't cheap. As opposed to a lot of the other game videos I do, I always like to talk about how good of a deal I got on these, and although I did use a lot of things like store credits, the customer loyalty rewards program where I get so much off of a purchase, this Vault event came at a time where I really didn't have a lot of money to spend because the holiday season's coming up, I have to buy gifts for someone else, and the expenses that come with that season. But thankfully there's enough quality titles here that I think this is going to take me a while to get through these games, and I'm really looking forward to playing through them a lot more. One thing I do like about this Vault event is I can guarantee that each of the games work, or I can get my money back by returning it back to the store. But also, I like collecting here more than paying the prices on eBay, because I can physically inspect the item to make sure it's complete in box, the disc doesn't have too many scratches, the case is in good shape. For me, it's just a lot better experience buying it from a brick-and-mortar store, which is becoming a rarer occurrence, as a lot of the games that are usually in these stores are games that I already have. They have common titles such as Wii Sports for the Wii, Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo, Sonic for the Sega Genesis, but because I've been collecting for years now, those are games I already have. So it's nice of the stores to actually put together an event like this where collectors like me who may have the more common titles can finally find some of the games they can't find normally in store. That said, that's going to wrap things up for this video. If you have any recent game finds you want to let me know about, please let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you thought about the game pickups I had in this video and what I should be on the lookout for in the future. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.